The fog came off the black water in rolling sheets that swallowed sound and color, so that the city before dawn seemed carved out of wet wool and rancid smoke. The docks lay quiet save for the slap of water under the pilings and the slow groan of hull against bollard. In that gray hour before the baker's fires, the rats owned the world. A boy with raw feet and a rope-belted tunic knelt at the edge of the quay and coaxed them with a crust, whispering to them as if they were shy dogs. He never saw the boots until their shadow fell over his hands. "City's levy," one of the two gold cloaks said, and ground his heel over the crust until it burst into paste and splinters. The boy made a sound like an empty kettle. "Please, sir, my ma. Please, sir," the second mimicked, tipping the visor of a dented helm, his breath sour with last night's ale. "Your ma pays in flour or in flesh, and you'll pay in coin. That's the law men like us keep." The first guard, a thick-necked man with a slice of burgundy cloth tied around his bicep, held out his hand. The boy had 2 pennies, both green with old sweat, and he stared at them long enough for the second guard to grow impatient and backhand him. The boy tumbled, skidded on wet planks, and would have gone into the river if a hand had not closed, hard as iron, around the back of his tunic. "Mind you don't fall," the newcomer said. His voice was dry gravel dragged across the bottom of a bucket. He set the boy on his feet with careless ease and turned to the gold cloaks as one might turn to flies. He was tall. Even without the dog's head helm he carried dangling by its ear. He wore a patched cloak that had once been black and a rough tunic dark with travel. But the way he stood, slightly turned as if to lead with his left, and the way his right hand hovered near the sword he had not bothered to hide, bespoke a habit of violence as old as bread. "This one's ours," the thick-necked guard said, flicking his chin at the boy. "He owes levy and delinquent boys go to the jowl to learn manly trades." "Do they?" the newcomer said. "Such as getting your teeth kicked in when you try to collect twice in a week." The guard's jaw worked. "What's your concern?" "That he'll starve," the man said. He shifted the helm to his left hand and let the right fall to the sword. "We could take it to a lord if you like. See if a lord thinks starving a scrap of a thing is the law." The second guard laughed. "A lord? You a lord, drunkard? Not smelling like that. Move along before I decide you're levying my time." The dog's head helm swung lazily like a bell. The man looked from one to the other and sighed as if pressed upon by an old nuisance. When the thick-necked one reached for him, fast too, mean as a weasel, the stranger stepped inside the grab and put his palm to the man's face and shoved him backwards with such casual strength that the fellow went sprawling on the slick planks, iron ringing. The second guard yanked at his sword, and the new man drew his own with a scrape that might have been a cough. The blade was plain, the sort a soldier might steal from a dead man and sharpen often. "Here's what you do," the newcomer said. "You two walk away and tell your captain that if he wants bread, he can come himself. If he wants bread out of boys' hands, he can bring a priest to take his confession after." "Nay." The second guard's sword wavered. The fog pooled around their legs. The thick-necked man got to one knee and peered up, squinting as if the gray light were lies and his eyes knew better. The stranger's ruined face was half shadow, half scar. A map of melted skin ran from temple to jaw on his right side and into the hairline, which had not much survived. The eye above it was deep-set, unreadable. "Oh," the thick-necked guard said softly. "Oh, dog." The other swallowed. "Thought he died." "I don't die easy," said Sandor Clegane. The boy sensed something large and dangerous had turned in his favor. He pressed himself to a mooring post and watched as the two guards helped each other up and went off quickly, their boots clacking a stuttered retreat, muttering about captains and orders. Sandor did not bother to follow them with his eyes. He pushed his sword back into its sheath and glanced down at the boy. "You hungry?" he asked. The boy nodded because speaking might bring tears. "Good," Sandor said. "You'll lead me where they bake then. We'll see about bread that doesn't come with a jailer." "Named how?" They moved through the waking city, past shuttered shops and sleeping carts, along the street of seeds where the smell of damp grain lived in the wood as surely as any ghost, and past the tannery run where hides soaked in piss turned the air to vinegar and rot. The boy darted ahead, barefoot light, then circled back when the man's longer stride closed the gap. He kept glancing at the helm. Boys in Flea Bottom knew tales of the Hound, how he'd cut down men for looking at him, how he'd snatched babes to roast on spits, how he'd saved a highborn girl and then tried to steal her away. The boy had never known what to believe. What he saw now was a man who walked as if the earth were a stubborn horse, and the earth did not buck him. They found the baker's shop a little way off the street of Flower, where a crooked sign hung on 2 nails and read Hob in a thick, self-satisfied hand. Hob himself was a man with arms like hams and a burnished, bald head. His ovens had already begun to glow, not fire-bright, but a sullen red like a banked anger. He glanced up when they entered and jerked his chin at the boy. "You paid yesterday," Hob said. "I've a list, Tomer. I'm not a charity." "He paid no such," Sandor said. "He was levied twice for the crown." "The crown levies us all twice and thrice," Hob said blandly. "Flowers, dear. Add a pinch of war and you've a loaf baked in ashes. Bake too much in ashes and you'll forget the taste of bread." Hob regarded the newcomer more carefully. His eyes hovered on the helm. He licked his lips as if tasting a memory. "You eat at my table once," he said slowly. "You threw me a copper and told me I'd overbaked my crusts." "You did," Sandor said. "You've gotten better." "I've not gotten better," Hob said, affronted. He looked at the boy. "Tomer, is that truth? The gold cloaks at you again?" The boy nodded. "Bugger their captains," Hob said without much heat, and lifted a peel to slide a row of fat loaves deeper into the oven's throat. "There's a pot in the back, spend the steam before it thins, and 2 rolls for your pockets. Not 3, you clever wee thief." Tomer blinked. His eyes shone. He darted away, leaving the men. "Not a charity," Sandor said. "I'm not," Hob said. "He cleans my ash trench and my buckets of sour, and in winter he sleeps under the flower table with cats for company." He gave Sandor a look over his shoulder. "Some of us keep lists. Some of us keep doors. You want a roll you can pay or burn me." "I've burnt enough," Sandor said. "And I can pay." He set a fat coin on the counter. Hob picked it up with swollen fingers and tested it with his teeth. "What's the like of you buying bread for alley brats?" the baker asked. Sandor did not answer. He took a roll and bit off its end while steam still wreathed it. Hob watched, and there came into his face an expression not quite respect and not quite prudence. A baker's accounting of appetites and debts. He was a guildsman with 5 ovens and 3 apprentices who stole butter whenever he turned his back, and he had lived long enough to know that kings came and went, but a man who could keep men from taking his bread might matter more than any gold lion stamped on wax. "You'll be wanting more than rolls," Hob said at last. "If gold cloaks are hunting you, you'll want beer and a back door." "They're not hunting me," Sandor said. "They don't hunt. They sniff and tear. I had a hound once that hunted. He was worth 3 king's men." "Man, guy, you had a hound," Hob said carefully, though his eyes went to the helm. "Where's he now?" "Doing what's wise," Sandor said, and did not look at the fire. By the time the sun burned a pale hole in the fog, the word had slipped along alleys and through shutter slats that something big and ugly and known had returned to the city. Gold cloaks murmured at their watchposts and tightened straps. A rat-catcher named Jen, who wore a rope of little bones as if it were a lord's chain of office, spat a brown rope of juice and said, "Dog'll bite the wrong hand, and they'll put him down proper." A lamplighter named Pate, who'd lost 3 fingers to frost years ago and never forgot the taste of it, said, "Maybe he'll bite the right hand finally," and the bones around Jen's neck clicked disapprovingly. Sandor did not present himself to captains or lords or priests. He moved where bellies moved, where a pot might feed 10 if not stolen by 2, where a child learned to be quicker than a man's boot. He found a woman named Kella, a laundress whose mouth was reddened with lye and whose shoulders were carved by buckets, trying to pull her daughter from a cart where she'd hidden among sacks of barley. The driver, a leathery man with a Tyrell rose stitched on his cloak, was stammering about orders and allotments. The barley belonged to the queen. It belonged to the sept. It belonged to whomever had signed a paper in a language he could not read. Sandor took the girl down without asking permission and set her on her feet. She looked up at him and did not scream. He set his great hand upon the driver's shoulder and squeezed until orders and allotments went soft. "Bread first," Sandor said. "Paper after." "You'll get yourself hanged," Kella said later, after the barley had become gruel and Tomer had licked a bowl until it shone. "They hang men who say bread first. They hang women for less. They hang for sport," Sandor said. "Bread's as good an excuse as any." He eyed the child, who eyed him back with the grave assessment of a general. "Teach her to run, not to curtsy." "She's my Ellen," Kella said, touching her hair. "I'll teach her to hide in the washtubs and to lie to strange men who buy her porridge." "She'll need a knife," Sandor said. Kella went still, then laughed, and he did not think it unkind that she laughed at him, because the sound slid something tight in his chest open. "Your sort says knives like other folks say prayers," she said. "It comforts you to hear the word. Prayers won't open a belly," Sandor said. "Knife will." She stepped closer, tilting her head to study the rough seam of scar tissue that pulled at his mouth. "And what opens a heart?" "Wine," he said after a beat. And she laughed again. He went away thinking of the sound. He tried to drink as he had drunk when nights were thick with the stench of mud and men and the king's cruel laughter. But wine gave him thoughts now, not mercy. Nights came anyway, with their alleys full of murmur. He sat under the overhang of Hobbs' shop and watched lamplight widen and contract like a pulse up the street of steel. He watched gold cloaks move in squads, bristling with halberds and orders, and he saw where their eyes slid away, where an alley was too narrow to bother with, where a woman's hands made even a captain feel the press of his mother's palm. He began to know those eyes better than he knew the turnings of the city. There was a place behind Hobbs' ovens where the ash from yesterday went before men with shovels carried it off to brickmakers. Sandor sat there when the fire was sleeping and traced lines in the ash with a thumb. Streets, posts, wells. How the crown sat on its hill like a spider and how the web ran down, sticky with fear. He'd done this once with battlefields, with villages and burned crofts, and where the river narrowed to trap men in iron. Map thinking, his brother had mocked, as if a map were less a weapon than a sword. A rat scuttled over his boot and he twitched, then stilled. He had not twitched for rats in 10 years. Fire, though. The fire sighed in the oven's throat, and a cold sound ran up his spine like water on old coals. Hob came out carrying a heel of bread covered in salt. "You'll draw yourself a kingdom there," the baker said, nodding at the ash. "Then what?" "Then I'll feed it," Sandor said. Hob snorted. "You'll need granaries, and men. The gold cloaks answer to a man they fear. Fear's a kind of glue." "I know," Sandor said. "I was glue." "Who do you answer to now?" Hob asked mildly. "Me," Sandor said, and the baker grunted as if that were sensible. In Flea Bottom, it takes 3 days for word to turn into a plan and 2 more for a plan to turn into a habit. On the 6th day, carts began to keep to the left-hand side of certain streets, and lamplighters hung 2 candles instead of 1 from posts not yet burned for fuel, and a chalk mark appeared on shutters and door jambs. A dog's paw, crude and unmistakable. Kella said men were lining up to wear the mark on their sleeves, and Sandor swore, because he had not meant to start a banner. He let Hob talk him into letting the sign stand anyway. Folk needed to know where a loaf might be safe, or a woman, or just a word. "A word can be a loaf," Hob said, kneading dough with a savage heel of his hand. "A word telling a man that another man has eyes on him can keep a loaf whole." "Eyes," Sandor said, and looked at the boy Tomer, who stood very still to avoid being noticed and failed as any small boy fails at being smoked. "You want work?" Tomer's eyes became round moons. "You'll take a bucket," Sandor said, "and carry it to the Jake's holes before dawn in the alley behind the sept of the candlemakers. Not for the piss boy. Watch who goes in and who comes out. If any come out with ink on their fingers in a purse too light for letters, you will follow them and mark their doors with a paw where no one sees it, unless they know where to look." "What's ink on their fingers mean?" Tamar asked, breathless. "Means they write orders for men like you," Sandor said, "and steal the city with quills." The boy nodded with ferocious gravity. "He'll get himself caught," Hob grumbled. "He'll be a cat's toy for some clerk." "He's too quick," Sandor said. "And he smells like rivers." He was not building an army, not yet. Armies needed coin and bread and banners. What he needed were eyes and hands and stubbornness. He gathered laundresses and lamplighters, rat catchers and fishwives, dockhands and the broken-lipped men who worked the tanneries until they no longer note the smell of their own houses. He found a gold cloak named Mudge whose left ear had been torn in some alley fight, and who had a habit of looking at his boots when Captain screamed. Mudge knew the watchposts that mattered and the ones that only pretended to. He knew which sergeant kept a ledger of bribes that might make a lord blush if lords blushed. He came drunk to their second meeting, ashamed to be afraid, and Sandor took the skin from his hands and threw it into the ash trench. "You drink after," Sandor said. "Or never." Mudge scratched at his ear stump. "You'll get us all hanged," he said thickly. "I remember being told that," Sandor said. "By who?" "A man I don't name," Sandor said, and Mudge looked at the helmed face and did not ask again. There were priests, too. A little septon named Tolio, who had a voice like the inside of a shell and a gentleness he could not seem to kill no matter how often he tried. A hard-eyed septa named Lysara, whose strap had taught half the orphanage their letters and the other half to run. The High Sparrow preached in courts and kitchens, and in the gutters themselves, barefoot as a truth. And men and women tore at themselves for sins, because repentance gave them something to do with their hands. Sandor listened once at the edge of the crowd, and felt his teeth grind at the man's thin voice. After the sermon, the High Sparrow walked where they walked. He had the knack of becoming small among the small and large among the large, as good leaders do. When he came upon the dog's paw chalked at shoulder height under a drainpipe, his face tightened and smoothed, an old man's truce. "Brother," he said, because Sandor had not bothered to hide, "I have heard that a certain hound runs the alleys, snatching back bones. That hound would run better at a man's heel than on his own." "You'd have me on a leash," Sandor said, "with a loop of prayers. With a cord of vows, no less binding," the High Sparrow said. "We both would keep men from harm. We both would feed the hungry. You'll feed their souls and starve their bellies if some lord whispers that the grain goes to the poor and the poor vote with their mouths," Sandor said. "You'll turn them to penance and leave them thin. I've seen thin. You've seen fire," the High Sparrow said calmly, as if speaking weather. "And so you know bread is not the only hunger men have. There is a hunger to be right in the eyes of gods." "I don't care for gods," Sandor said. "Care or not, they care for you," the High Sparrow said. And there was no threat in it, only certainty so quiet it made Sandor want to shout. He did not shout. The two men regarded one another like strangers on a narrow stair, neither stepping back, neither quite willing to brush. At last the High Sparrow inclined his head. "Walk in light if you want kneel in it," he said, and moved on, his gray robe trailing city dust. "You'll clash with him," Lysara said later, binding a bruise on a dockhand's shin with strips cut from her own sleeve. "He'll think you wicked and you'll think him blind." "I think him dangerous," Sandor said. "He'll start a fire he calls holiness." "You're not wrong," the Septa said. "But sometimes men need to be warmed before they can chew." On the 10th day there was a beating at the river gate. Goldcloak stopped a cart loaded with sacks that smelled of onions and smoke, and in their sifting found beneath them 2 casks marked with the stylized flame and dragon of the alchemist's guild. The captain who oversaw the seizure was a lean man with dark hair and a yellow feather in his helm. He liked to be seen doing things. He pried a cask's head and dipped a finger and held it up to show his men the viscous green gleam. "Wildfire," he said, pleased. His men made the sign for warding and took a step back. The captain smiled. "Set it with the rest," he said. Queen's orders. Hobbs' apprentice saw this, and the news went ahead of the men carrying the casks. The smell of vinegar drifted after them. The alchemists always smelled of their pickled vaults. Wisdom Halling, it was said, had a ledger of jars tall enough to climb out of hell on. Sandor had seen hell and did not think a ladder would help. He went to the guild hall that afternoon. It was a pride with old bricks and iron lattices, a house that considered itself a castle. The doors were painted black and flanked by two men who wore black as if it kept them safe. Sandor did not waste words on them. He went to the side of the building where the ovens breathed and layered walls expressed their age in a seep of damp. He found a boy there, a narrow creature with ink on his fingers and a clever mouth too quick for wisdom. The boy watched him, fascinated, as boys are with things that might kill them. "You know where they keep the jars?" Sandor said. "No," said the boy, and too quickly. "We don't keep them. We cultivate them." "Like cabbages," Sandor said dryly. "Take me to your cabbages." The boy hesitated, then shrugged. "You'll never get past Halling. He loves his jars like a man loves his daughters." "None. Daughters can be married off," Sandor said, "and jars can be moved." He did not go through Wisdom Halling. He went through a corridor that smelled of alum and old parchment, and down a stair that had been laid when kings wore fur against winter in their own halls, and along a basement where a constant drip somewhere left a patient rash on stone. He came to a heavy door and passed a second, lighter door that clicked with delicate locks, as if afraid of waking its own contents. The vault beyond was cool. There were shelves, and each shelf had jars, and each jar held the green sleep of 1,000 small suns. "They mean to burn the slums," he said softly, to the boy. "The Queen says there is lice in those streets," the boy whispered, and his voice thrilled with a kind of horror he liked for how close it looked to bravery. "You burn a nest to save a house. Burn a man to save his cloak," Sandor said. He took a step closer to the nearest jar, and the room seemed to tilt around him. Green, wet, the color of heat before it becomes flame. The taste of smoke was in his mouth, though there was no smoke here, only the memory of it, carved into him like his scars. The boy said. "I'm remembering," Sandor said, and took another step, until his breath made a fog on the jar's cool skin. He set his palm there and stood very still. "Don't," the boy said helplessly, as if the jar might be offended by touch and wake. "I won't break it," Sandor said, and did not add what he knew as well as he knew his own name, that some things break without hands. He turned from the jars and left by the same path, and the boy followed because seeing a monster turn his back on fire is something you'll tell your grandchildren. That evening he sent Mudge to whisper among gold cloaks who had wives and daughters and lived near Flea Bottom, men who shared a wall with hunger and knew how quickly flame ran along tinder dry nights. The next morning, 2 casks marked for the guild never reached the guild. They vanished into the river with a sound like a held breath leaving the body, and no one saw who guided them over the quay. Wisdom Halling thundered in delicate phrases about waste and war, and the danger of interfering with substances known only to his order. The High Sparrow spoke about the sin of fear and the sin of pride and how both set cities afire. The Queen, red-lipped and sleepless, demanded to know why the people who owed her love were growing impertinent. Sir Osmond Kettleblack assured her love could be encouraged by steel. "Encourage them then," she said. So the gold cloaks went into Flea Bottom 3 abreast, their halberds ready, and their eyes sliding away from signs on doorposts they did not know how to read. There was no barricade, only laundry lines hung low, so men ducked and fumbled their halberds, and slop thrown from windows where rats had feasted first. The first alley turned them, and the second cut off their retreat, and by the time the third spilled them into a courtyard that no one had ever thought to call a square, men on rooftops had lines coiled around chimney pots. Halberds are awkward weapons. They are very handsome on a sunny day when your enemy is 10 yards away in a field where horses can run, and they are miserable things when your enemy is a woman with a skillet. Sandor did not direct the fight. He had arranged it, and now it happened. He went where lines thinned, and a man with an officer's plume threatened to become luck instead of hazard. He broke a spear with the heel of his hand, cut a man's belt so his cuisses fell and tripped him, punched a visor with such force the nosepiece bent and trapped the poor fool inside his own helm like a songbird. In the midst of it he saw Kella, hair bound up in a rag, throw left-handed and strike a man's cheek with a stone. He saw Tomer dart in and take a purse and a knife. Good boy. And dart out again before the owner even understood the way that his hip had changed. He saw Mudge keep his own men back, letting the city watch discover the taste of reluctance. When it was done, and the square smelled like iron and onions and fear, he shouted until throats stopped and fists unclenched. "Done!" he roared. "Done. You," he pointed at the officer, wrists bound in a washing line. "Tell your captain this. If he wants to levy, he levies our lists and our doors. He wants fire, he comes to the ovens and asks the men who tend them. He wants order, he steps where I step." "You think yourself king," the officer said through a split lip. Sandor walked to him and bent so that their faces were a hand's breadth apart. "If I were king," he said softly, "you'd be dead." He straightened. Around them the alley pealed with taut, astonished laughter. He sent the prisoners back uncut, with 2 loaves each, and the weight of the city's eyes on their backs. He'd learned something from dogs and children. You reward, you do not simply punish. Men would tell that tale a dozen times before sundown. Bread travels faster than fear when it's free. For a week, the city breathed differently. The paw mark appeared like a secret handshake in places that had never spoken to one another. In the lamplighter's niche near the river gate. In the dye yard where women beat color into cloth with paddles heavy as sin. In a courtyard behind a shuttered brothel, where a narrow-faced man with a scar of his own on his cheek kept knives in his boots and bandages in a drawer. Folk began saying the Hound walked for the poor. They said he wore no colors but ash. They said he had turned from lords to men. Men liked to say that. It made their spines straighter. Cersei sent a letter to the High Septon, asking if the faith could remind the commons of their place. The High Sparrow replied with a sermon about how cobblers and queens both have knees, and how those knees bend in the same direction. She threw the letter in the fire and watched the edges curl and blacken. It pleased her that such words should burn. She did not, for once, think of wildfire. Marguerite Tyrell, less pleased by fires of any kind, sent grain into the city in her own name and charity to the orphanages. It would have made a good story if any of the grain had reached the orphanages. It reached the bakeries instead. The paw mark grew over the roses on the sacks, quick chalk put to canvas between cart and door. It might have been mischief if it had been less efficient. "Your city is becoming busy," said Grandmaster Pycelle to the Queen in a voice that had never before held a question. "It is becoming disobedient," she said. "Disobedience is cured." "Sometimes," the old man said. "Sometimes it spreads. There is a precedent, Your Grace. In the reign of—" "Be silent about old kings," Cersei said. "We have new problems." She sent Sir Meryn Trant and Sir Boros Blount into the streets with 30 men at their backs and a panel of judges who valued their throats. Meryn had become thick in the middle and practiced his justice with the same lazy cruelty he used on boys in training yards. Boros enjoyed food more than battle and blood almost as much as food. They went to make an example. That is always dangerous in a city where example is a form of theater. They chose the candlemaker's sept, thinking it soft. They broke in the door and split 2 women's heads on the steps and cut a boy who had stood too straight. Then they turned and found the street full, and the street behind that, and windows full too, and roofs, eyes everywhere. Men and women, lamplighters with their poles, rat catchers with their clubs, children with stones, and the intentness of cats. Sandor came from the mouth of an alley with his dog's head helm on and his sword bare. He did not speak. He walked through the space that opened for him as it used to open for knights in gold, and the men in gold felt something like a hand on their chests. He stopped 3 paces from Sir Meryn, and waited so neatly it made Meryn flush. "You think to fight all of us?" Meryn sneered. You think yourself hard iron, deserter. I think you're a sack of old lard, Sandor said. I think if I cut you open, pigeons will fly out. It was not clever, but it made the crowd laugh, and laughter is a weapon more humbling than steel. Marin rushed, clumsy with anger, and Sandor stepped aside as if avoiding a puddle, and cut Marin twice, once across the inside of the elbow, so the sword hand went soft, and once along the cheek, so the visor snapped shut on blood. Marin went to one knee, enraged and suddenly aware of it. Cerberus, to his credit, moved to protect him. Sandor met him the way a man meets a tree he's decided to fell, patient, inexorable. Boros was stronger than Marin and slower. Sandor used the slowness the way a baker uses rest and dough. He let it teach shape to the fight. 3 strikes rang on Boros's breastplate like a bell tolling the hours of a bad day, and the 4th slid under the arm. Boros made a sound like a soup boiling over. He did not die. He merely discovered he would not be doing much more than breathing for some weeks. Sandor took a step back and raised his sword so all could see it clean of their blood. Then he set the point down on the cobbles and leaned on the hilt as if resting. "Go home," he said to the men behind Marin and Boros. "Tell your wives you did a day's work. Tell them what men you fought. If you want to fight them again, come with more men and sharper steel. If you don't come at all." No. The men looked at one another. Their captains nowhere to be seen because captains love corners when crowds love streets. One by one, they turned away. Sandor let them go. He had no use for dead gold cloaks when live ones carried stories. That night fire came. Not wildfire. That would come later if folly was a river with many bends. This was common fire, cheap and hungry, thrown from a jar into a rag and stick world. 3 houses along the alley where Kella lived went up at once, and a 4th where a man stored old straw in his loft went up like a prayer. The flames moved the way men do when ordered, along the path of least resistance with an eagerness to prove themselves. Sandor woke to shouting, and a sound he did not hear but knew. The high, thin scream of pitch catching. He froze as he always froze, for a count of breaths that refused to come. He saw the room where the straw smelled of apples, and the shadow across the door and the torch, like a dragon's eye at the crack. And he was a boy again with a brother who laughed like iron ringing. His body remembered cowering, but the city did not have time for his cowering. He forced his legs under him and ran. Firelight painted the street in colors men should not see. The heat felt animal, a shaggy thing crowding his shoulder and pushing him from side to side. He heard Kella's voice, not screaming but counting. "Ellen, Ellen, Ellen." And he found her in the cavern by the oven where neighbors had gathered because brick holds heat and beats it back. She had Ellen clutched to her and a boy he did not know half under her skirt, pressing his face to her thigh as if to crawl inside. "Back door," Sandor said, voice gone to iron filings. "Kella's is bricked," Hob shouted from somewhere in the smoke. "The mason never finished it. Gods help us." "Gods don't," Sandor said, and went into the alley where the flames had learned to run. He went because Ellen looked at him without crying, and because his hands had learned other habits than fear. He kicked a door with his heel and it gave like stale bread, and he went inside to where a man lay on his back in his own smoke and dragged him out by his ankle. Coughing green bile. He went back, and the ceiling fell where he had been, and he went back again because he had heard a sound under the larger sound, a child's hiccoughing sob. He found the child under a table wrapped in a blanket that had a stag embroidered on it, a cast-off from someone else's life. He gathered the bundle and came out into the courtyard where smoke climbed the walls like ivy gone to madness. He did not know he was crying until the soot set into the wet tracks and walked with him after. By morning, the fire had found no purchase on the brick ovens, and had failed to jump the alley the way a foolish horse fails a ditch. The cost was 3 houses and 2 men and a girl who had been old enough to bleed and had not been quick enough to run. The city counted its losses in that calm tone it uses when it does not wish to scream. Sandor went to the Alchemist's Guild again. He took Mudge and 2 lamplighters and Kella, because Kella's eyes could make a man who thought he understood women remember his mother's hand. They went in broad day. The guards put hands on hilts and then on the doors, and then stood aside because sometimes the order of such things is a prayer to prudence. Wisdom Howling met them in a small room with a fresco of a dragon painted in thin, careful strokes. He wore a chain with green beads the way masters wore their links. He smiled as a man smiles at children who have wandered into a counting house. "You must understand," Howling said gently. "That wildfire is not for you. It is an instrument of state." "It's an instrument of fire," Sandor said. "States burn too." Howling spread his hands. "We keep records. We keep order. We measure the—" "You keep jars," Kella said, and the softness of her voice made it cruel. "And you tell your queens how to throw them." "We advise," Howling said. "We are not fools, my dear woman. Wildfire is temperamental. It obeys recipe, not men. It will not harm a king in his castle, if it is not called to do so. It is shepherded. Nay, like sheep with 1,000 teeth," Lysara said, who had come without being asked and stood at Sandor's shoulder like a shadow that had decided to take up arms. "You will not bring casks through the river gate again. Our city forbids it." Howling blinked. "Your city? Someone has to own it," Sandor said. "If not the folk who live in it, then a jar." Howling lifted his chin. "The queen will hear of this." "She will," Sandor said. "She will hear we forbid the use of jars in alleys. That if any jar is thrown in Flea Bottom, we will throw jar and man and wisdom both into the river. And if any guildsman thinks to step there in the night with his secrets and his little fires, I will cut him open and see what color he burns." Aye. He stepped forward and did not draw his sword. He did not need to. Wisdom Howling took a step back anyway, and another, until the dragon on the fresco behind him seemed to halo him with its thin painted fire. After that, there were fewer fires. There was, however, food. The reed ships in the bay had been waiting on a wind that had no interest in politics. When at last it came, and when the quays thrummed with rope and shouts and the muscular grunts of men who make 1,000 small decisions in a day with their hands, the sacks that spilled onto carts were stamped with roses and writs. The writs named the queen and the faith, and sometimes the same sack belonged to both at once. That is a miracle only accountants pretend to understand. Sandor's mark, chalk paw, crossed out roses. He did not steal the grain. He paid for it with coin from Mudge's ledger of bribes. Coin extorted from the city returned to the city, and with labor. Dockhands unburdened carts. Lamplighters ran to and fro with lists like messages to battlefield captains. Kella's laundresses became quartermasters who had counted coppers until their fingers knew numbers better than any maesters of Bacchus. Hobbs' ovens took drafts of heat until they felt a... "Is this what ruling is?" Kella asked once, looking over a crumpled paper where names and loaves sat in neat rows. "Keeping enough bread from those who take it to give it to those who eat it. It's keeping blade from loaf long enough to slice it tidy," Hobbs said. His thick fingers tapped the symbols he knew as shapes, not letters. "And not taking a fee to taste every time." "I'd take a taste," Sandor said. He did. He ate wherever a pot steamed because his body remembered doing without. He did not try to be holy about it, and he did not apologize. He slept when his legs buckled and woke when Tomer tugged his sleeve and said, "They're saying the Queen says we're a nuisance, even Sir Osmond says so." "They've called me worse than nuisance," Sandor said. "What's worse?" Tomer asked avidly. "Loyal," Sandor said, and patted the boy's head as if he were scratching a dog. He stopped himself on the second pat. "You see to the jakes again. Watch for the men with clean hands and clean boots who walk like they own mud." Tomer ran like wind stolen from a better neighborhood. The city watch split along seams no one had found because no one had looked. Some captains held to the keep and the hill with a soldier's stubborn faith in walls. Others began walking with their men along streets where chalk paws were not an insult but a map. When Cersei called their captains to account, they sent deputies with sorry mouths and statements about logistics. "The alleys are insufficiently patrolled," one said, which was true. "And The men are insufficiently provisioned, which was also true. Provision them, she said, with fear. That was when she did what she should never do, and always did anyway. She wrote a letter to her father's memory, and not to the city she ruled. The letter asked for men from the countryside to clear the rot from the streets. She forgot the countryside had its own hungers and grievances, and that men brought to clear rot often became the rot. They came in 2s and 3s at first, hedge knights and masterless men who had sold their bells for harness leather, and then in a small company under a banner patched so many times it had more history than honor. They had a captain who knew to ride down a narrow street with a lance couched low so it made a wall of death. Sandor pushed men aside and took that lance on his sword. His legs braced, and he felt the jolt wrench his shoulders and his soul, and he didn't fall. The horse did. He cut the captain's throat as the horse scrambled, and the alley howled with a strange joy. He lifted the bloodied lance and tossed it onto a dung heap as if he were throwing out a broken broom. The next day, a woman came to him in Hobbs' oven heat, with her hair in a scarf that had once been blue. "Lord," she said. "Not that," he said. "Lord," she repeated stubbornly, because some words are less about men than about the need to describe home. "The men who ride down from the hill took my boy and say it's levy for service. He's 12. "What's your name?" Sandor asked. "Mara," she said. "My boy's Dren, named him for his grandfather because Dren had a back like an ox cart and a temper like summer. They'll give him a spear and a sash and tell him he's a man. But he's little and his chest is bad and cold, and he takes too many steps with his left foot when he runs because he broke a toe once, and it sets strange." "No." "Where did they take him?" Sandor said, and she told him. And it was to the yard of a brown townhouse on the Street of Sisters, where Sir Osmond liked to train boys when he could not amuse himself in other ways. Sandor told Tomer to fetch Mudge, and he told Mudge to fetch 2 watchmen who owed him for a night when the city did not eat them alive. They went to the yard. They cut not a soul. They broke a gate and found boys standing with spears that shook and eyes that did not. Boys want to be men so badly they forget how costly the price is. Sir Osmond came out with a smile like oil. "Ah," he said. The cur." "Sir," Sandor said. He stood with his sword down, not to be taken for any sort of champion in a tale. "Let the boys go." "I'll let them go when they've earned a sash," Osmond said. "This is the Crown's will. The Crown's will can be pried up with a good knife, and the nail underneath isn't worth a copper," Sandor said. "You took them without writ." "I don't need writ," Osmond said. "I need a sword. I have one." He lifted it and made a show of the cut that left the tip singing. Sandor thought of a dozen ways to end this quickly, and 2 to end it slowly, and decided the boys needed to see a man who might be the worst of them be put down like meat. He stepped forward and did not bother to raise his blade until Osmond came within arm's reach. Then he lifted it as casually as he'd lift a loaf to inspect the crust, turned the other man's blade with his own, and slammed his forehead into Osmond's nose. Bone cracked. Osmond staggered, dizzied and bleeding, and before he could find his feet again, Sandor put his boot to the back of the knight's knee and brought him down. "You've seen knights on their knees," Sandor said to the boys. "Some pray. Some beg, some bleed, some do all 3. Take your spears and go to your mothers and tell them you're men today because you walked home. You'll die for this." Osmond spat through blood. "Someday," Sandor said. In the Red Keep they began to say the Hound wanted the city, and perhaps he did. In that blunt way, he wanted a jug and a roof, and a place to put his sword when his arm was tired. In the streets, they began to say the city wanted him, and that was truer. It wanted a thing not born from parchment. It wanted a jaw and a hand. It did not know that jaw and hand would refuse a crown as if the metal were poison. They came to him at night with petitions. A cooper wanted space to keep his staves because the watch had commandeered his yard. A midwife wanted men at her back while she worked near the mud gate where soldiers liked to drag women out with babes half-born. A butcher wanted permission to take his beef to the Sept kitchens because the Queen's men had turned him away from the keep for being too poor to sell to a lord's table. Sandor had nothing to write with, and nothing to write on, and he handed out decisions like loaves. Quick, straight, sometimes wrong. When he was wrong, he went himself the next day, and lifted the wrong off a man with his hands. It is a rare ruler who does this. It makes folk forgive many sins. Will you sit with the ragged council? Lysara asked him one afternoon when the oven slept and Hob slept in a chair with his mouth slightly open. She meant the line of chairs in the goddess court on the street of silk where guilds sent men to argue and laugh and fight until something like a decision crawled out of their noise. You should sit the chair in the center. I've no arse for chairs, Sandor said, and Lysara snorted. Your arse is the least of the matter, she said. Men think with whatever part of them is the noisiest. Sit the chair. Let them make you what they already call you. Name. Isham? What's that? He asked, more wary than he let show. Warden, she said simply. Not lord, not king. Warden of the gates, warden of the loaves. I'll be warden of nothing, Sandor said. But I'll stand in a doorway. You would rather be a door than a throne, Lysara said. That's why they will trust you. Trust was a soft word that turned sharp in the mouth. He went to the goddess court anyway, and stood by the center chair while men in aprons and women with ledger-stained fingers argued prices and shares. He said no when they asked him to sit. He said yes when they asked him to speak. He said, bread before bribes, streets before houses, children before captains, and let them shout about how to make that a ledger. He did not like the way the room felt, like a trap set with cushions, but he liked the sight of Hob and Kella at a table with the ratcatcher Jen and the lamplighter Pate, and the gold cloak Mudge, all of them parsing a list. It made the city seem possible. News of a city that felt possible is a kind of plague. It runs faster than carts. It crosses the hill and goes into the keep by servants' mouths and knights' ears and queen's wine. Tommen heard it, and blinked, young and green and blended at the edges like watercolor. He looked at Marguerite, whose smile was a flower grown in careful soil, and at his mother, whose smile was a knife laid on a table. Is the city angry with me? He asked. The city does not know you, Marguerite said gently. The city knows hunger and men who take it away. If you feed it, it will love you. The city must be taught its place, Cersei said. I will not have a dog take my child's love. You never had it, Marguerite said in a voice soft as a needle's and just as bright. You borrowed it. Cersei slapped her and felt better for 5 breaths, and then worse for 20. She wrote another letter, this one to the alchemists. Sandor felt the city hold its breath. More jars, Mudge reported, eyes wide. They're not sending them in daylight. Night jars burn the same, Sandor said. You'll have to take the keep, Hob said, matter of fact. Else you'll be forever swatting flies while someone empties chamber pots into your kitchen. You take the keep with ladders and fools, Sandor said. And with men who don't mind dying. Is there any other kind? Hob asked quietly. Hey, Sandor said. Men who want to live and are brave enough to admit it. He did not plan a siege. He planned a refusal. He put men at the gates who owed him bread. He put women with stones on the roofs who owed him children. He spoke to the captains no one had thought to speak to, the ones who ordered the kitchens and the privies, and the daggermen who wait just outside rooms where no one announces them. He told them the city would not bring in jars because the city would not bring in jars, and sometimes truth has to be said as if it were prophecy. He fit himself to the alleys, to the flows of men and water, to the stubbornness of brick. It could have ended 3 ways, with a fire, with a river, or with a door opened from within. It ended with all 3. The night the Queen's men tried to carry 6 jars through the old Sally port beneath the wall, the one no one had used since Maegor, and everyone remembered in stories. Tommer was sitting with a bucket by the jakes because Sandor had told him to love the shameful places. He saw the men pass, hunched under weight and self-importance, and he tagged their backs with chalk paws as if he were blessing them. He ran not where men expect boys to run, but along a plank walk over a tannery trench, where piss water steamed and made men step back. He reached the goddess court at a dead run and hit Sandor in the thigh with his small fists. "They're under the wall," Tomer gasped. "They've got jars with the bad color. They've got the look of men who want to be remembered for something bad." Sandor went the way water goes. He moved through sleeping streets, past bundles of people whose sleep had never learned to lie deep. He gathered 24 without needing to shout. Mudge and Pate, Hob with a peel as tall as himself, Kella with a hooked blade for cutting laundry cords, Lysara with her strap and a knife tucked into it like a pen. They reached the sally port as the last of the jars moved through into the night air, and there was a moment when both sides could see one another as men, backlit by torch and fear. "Set them down," Sandor said. The man at the head of the line looked down at the jar in his arms as if seeing it for the first time. "We've orders," he said, and his voice sounded to his own ears like a story he would have told as a boy when pretending to be brave. "I've orders," Sandor said, "and they're older." The man hesitated. Behind him someone whispered, and the whisper was like a match struck in a room full of patience. The jar in the back wobbled. Sandor moved without thinking. He was a boy and a man at once, and he hurled himself forward not toward the jar but toward the arm that held it, slamming shoulder to muscle, turning the man with his weight so that if he dropped it, it would not strike stone. The jar slipped. Sandor's hands moved as if they were not his own. He caught the jar. It was cold, and the cold went up his arms in threads like ice, and the green within swam like a malignant eye. He held it to his chest as if it were a child, and the sound he made was not a sound he had ever made in any fight. "Easy," he told something that had never been easy. All around him men froze as if the air itself had said halt. The jar did not crack. Sandor set it down like a sleeping infant, and then let his hands hang at his sides because he could not remember how to move them. He looked up and found himself nose to nose with a captain whose eyes were full of the worst kind of fear. The kind that thinks itself duty. "Put them down," Sandor said once more, and this time the man obeyed. The 6 jars became 6 insults at their feet. Mudge moved and Lysara moved and Hob moved, careful as midwives. They took the jars like loans from a mad king, and they carried them away to a place beneath the river where old pilings held up some forgotten thing. They stacked them there and walled them into a tomb of their own making with brick and prayer and curses. "They'll find other jars," Hob said, hands shaking when he let go the last stone. "Hey," Sandor said, "but not those." In the keep the next day, Cersei slapped a servant and then cried, an old rage that had not found the right throat to strangle. Marguerite smiled in a way that meant nothing and everything. Tommen looked at his hands as if wondering what they were for. In the streets, the ragged council convened without chairs. They stood in the square outside Hobbs' ovens, and they spoke what had been whispered for weeks, and said aloud what had not been dared. "No more levies without writ," Lysara said, "and writs to be read by folk who raid. No more jars in alleys," Hobbs said. "Jars to be counted in the goddess court. Food first," Kella said. "Then prayers. Men can pray on full bellies or empty ones, but empty ones make louder prayers. No more taking boys," Mudge said. "If the crown wants men, he can come to the square and tell their mothers why. If he can look them in the face, we'll see. And judgments," Sandor said. His voice surprised him. It had not spoken in a day. "If a man steals a loaf, he works at an oven. If a man hurts a child, he loses the hand that did it. If a captain beats a woman with the pommel of his sword, I take that sword. If a lord wishes to hang a man, he must watch him die without turning his head. If he turns, he loses the right to hang another." "Me. You think to rule," someone shouted from the edge of the crowd. One of the captains of a weaver's hall, nervous of soldiers, nervous of mobs. "I think to stand in a doorway," Sandor said. "Hold it while folk pass. That's all I'm good for." "It might be enough," Lysara murmured. "It would not be enough forever." No one said this because sometimes you do not speak the winter before it arrives. Lords beyond the city watched the tale unfold as men watch fires on distant hills. Interested, cautious, ready to ride toward or away depending on whether the wind favored them. The Brotherhood without banners took an interest and then set it aside because their justice lay along roads with more trees than doors. In the Vale, a girl with red hair learned that the Hound, her hound, had become a story told by men who did not know the smell of lemon cakes, and she felt something strange break and knit in the same instant. In King's Landing, the Red Keep drew into itself like a turtle taught by gods to despise its own head. Cersei posted men at gates he'd never known the names of, and the names ran like this: King's Gate, River Gate, Dragon Gate, Lion Gate, Old Gate. She said them to herself as if they were spells, and they did not answer. Jaime returned from the Riverlands with dust in his hair and a face that had been carved down to some leaner truth than proud knight, and he stood with his handless arm hooked through his belt and listened to her speak of dogs to be drowned. He thought of the boy he had seen with a bucket by the Jakes, and the man who had carried a jar that should have eaten him alive, and did not. "You can't win a city with walls," he said to his sister, and she laughed. "How else?" she asked. "With doors," he said. "He's learned doors." "You'll fight him," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Jaime said, though he did not know for whom he would fight. The duel came because old gods or new like such shows, and because men believe they can cut knots with steel. Sir Osmond demanded trial by combat for his honors being dragged through ash, and the High Sparrow sanctioned it as if to say he was not afraid of swords. The square outside Baelor's Sept filled with men and women who had come to see whether a dog could kill a knight in daylight with everyone watching. Sandor put on the helm the way a penitent puts on hair shirt and went out. "Again," Osmond said through a nose still crooked. "But proper." Sandor agreed, and they crossed blades. There's little to say about good sword work that men have not said for as long as they've sharpened iron. Osmond was quick. Sandor was quicker. Osmond was proud. Sandor's pride had been burned off him like hair. Osmond went for the face as men always did. Sandor let him see it and then showed him what lived behind it. He turned the blade with a small movement of his wrist and struck with the inside of his hilt, and then with his knee, and then with the edge. And Osmond fell in the dust, his breath grunting out as if surprised to be required. Sandor set his boot on the man's sword and looked up at the steps. "Enough," the High Sparrow said. "Gods have had their sport." Cersei wanted blood. Sandor gave none. He stepped away and Osmond crawled from the dust and found, to his horror, that no one cared to help him stand. The crowd's sound was not roar or jeer. It was a murmur, and murmurs are worse. They sink into stone. After the duel, the keep's doors did not open for 3 days. On the 4th, Jaime came to the goddess court and stood with his cloak pinned by a simple brooch. He did not wear gold, only leather. He looked at Sandor and smiled in that weary way. Men smile when their histories brush and do not stick. "You'll speak for the city?" Jaime asked. "I don't speak," Sandor said. "I grunt and other folk put words to it and call it a speech." "Grunt, then," Jaime said. "We'll hear you." They haggled like merchants. Bread, justice, jars, boys, posts. Tommen would appear on the steps of Baelor with Margaery and pledge to walk the streets with bread carts once a week. Cersei would not be there. Jaime would come without kettle drums and stand where men could throw rotten cabbage and not be hanged for it. In return, the city would open the gates to ships whose captains had rights. The Ragged Council would be acknowledged as consultative, Jaime's word, and men who sat upon it would not be taken in the night unless they murdered someone in a way no one could ignore. "Who decides that?" Lysara asked, chin up. "I do," Jaime said honestly. Sandor watched him when he said it and decided it would be enough for now. "You'll be hated," Jaime said, glancing at Sandor. "I'm practiced," Sandor said. They kept their bargain long enough for men to think about harvests. Tommen ran beside the bread carts with Elin, and their shadows ran ahead, long and earnest. Kella counted rolls as if she were counting heartbeats. Hobbs Ovens practiced joy. Mudge stood watch at the river gate and did not take the coins held out in sweaty hands. He wrote names instead, laboring over the letters until each sign became a man he could remember when he slept. Sandor slept in a room above an old stable that had not seen a horse in years. He slept with his sword close and his helm nearer, and he woke sometimes with his hands clenched because fire lived in his tendons and dreamed when he did not. He woke once to find Ellen standing in the doorway with her hair a tangle and her eyes intent. "Is it true," she asked, "that you saved a lady?" "I tried," he said. "Did she sing?" Ellen asked, half shy. "She sang once," he said. He remembered the sound of a girl's voice in a cold city where lemon cakes tasted like longing. He remembered the lateness of that song and the way it had come when he had least deserved it. She sang like water. It doesn't stay in the hand. Ellen nodded, as if she understood more than he had given her. She held out something wrapped in rag. He opened it to find a small dog carved in wood, its head tilted, one ear bitten off by a knife that had refused delicacy. "It's ugly," she said proudly. "It can sit by your bed and bite bad men who come when you're asleep." He set it on the crate that served as his table, and it looked at him with the expression of dogs who have already forgiven you. He found himself smiling and did not punish himself for it. When the winter came, and it would, long, slow, inexorable as a habit, the city would be different and ice would teach it new paths. Lords would ride with banners and with writs and with arguments that sounded like righteousness and smelled like old fear. Perhaps they would take the city back in the name of order. Perhaps they would fail because men who keep their own doors do not surrender them easily anymore. Perhaps a green wildfire would eat Baylor's steps and write its history in a sky no one wanted to see. He could not know. He could only stand in the doorway and put his body there. Kella came sometimes and slept with him because warmth is a kind of bread, and both of them had learned to take it without shame. Lysera checked on his wounds and told him stories that made him snort and then doze and then dream without fire. Hob made him a loaf he called the dog's heel, crust hard enough to break a tooth if you were foolish and a heart soft enough to break a man if you were not. Tomer told him about the Jakes as if they were temples and about ink as if it were blood, and Sandor listened because boys who learn shame young become useful men. The dog's paw mark faded on some doors in the rain and was drawn again. It spread to streets where men had thought themselves too fine for chalk. It appeared once on a pike by the river gate, crudely painted over the lion of the Lannisters, and nothing happened for 3 days except that men smiled when they passed. On the 4th day, someone scrubbed it with a rag until only a ghost of the paw remained, and Sandor shook his head and walked on. He had been a prince's dog. He had been a monster in songs. He had been a deserter and a drunk and a man who feared a thing that other men called common. Now he was a door. He was the place someone had to go through to burn the poor. He thought perhaps that was enough for one life. On an evening when the fog came in again, this time thin and clean, as if the river had decided to wash the city's face, he sat on the step outside Hobbs' ovens and watched Ellen teach Tomer to juggle with 3 hard rolls gone stale. Hob pretended to grumble, but his eyes were fond. Kella's laugh moved across the square and caught in the eaves like a bit of ribbon. The lamplighter pate touched flame to wick, and the small light made a circle on the stones that felt like a hearth men could step into. A bell rang somewhere, low and steady, the kind you ring for bread and not for death. Sandor touched the wooden dog on the crate beside him and then, without knowing he had moved, reached down and scratched it behind its ear as if it might feel that through the grain. "Bread first," he said to no one in particular. And the city breathed, and he breathed with it. And when the fog closed around them, it felt less like a shroud and more like a blanket laid by a hand that, if not gentle, had at least learned where to rest.